Hello. I'd like to mention briefly that I received a package in the post this morning from a friend of mine, Dr. Jonathan Oates, who's a well-known crime writer, and he's been working on the case of Annie Hearn for the past couple of years and written a book on it, which is called The Murders of Annie Hearn. I've read it in draft. It's an excellent work, and I look forward to reading it at the weekend. It's a case I covered in 2019, I think it was, for those who are familiar with the channel. The case of Adelaide Bartlett is a fascinating case. It's one which I've meant to do for some time, and I've been researching it over a number of years, really. And it's only in the past few weeks that I've pulled together the various threads of my research, and this is the result. It's my best effort. Edwin Bartlett was in a good mood on the 31st of December 1885, returning to his apartment at 85 Claverton Street in Pimlico with his wife Adelaide. He informed his landlady that he believed his recent health problems now lay behind him. He went to bed early that evening, and his wife Adelaide fell asleep in the chair beside his bed. It being New Year's Eve, the landlady and her husband, Frederick and Catherine Doggett, were having a party to welcome in the new year, retiring in the early hours. The maid took coals for the fire into the Bartlett's room before midnight, and then went to bed herself and fell asleep. The next thing she knew, she was being awakened at around 4 a.m., and Adelaide Bartlett calling to her, "Alice, I want you to go for Dr. Leach. I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." While Alice went for the doctor, Adelaide woke the Doggetts. Frederick Doggett entered the room to a strong smell of chloroform. "Do you think he's dead?" Adelaide inquired. "Yes," he replied. "He must have been dead 2 or 3 hours." Adelaide said she had fallen asleep and found her husband lying on his face. She moved him into his present position and poured half a pint of brandy down his throat to revive him. Doggett commented that Edwin looked like he had simply fallen asleep, and Adelaide said she had closed his eyes when she realized he was dead. Doggett saw a 3/4 filled glass on the mantel-shelf. He sniffed it and concluded it was brandy mixed with chloroform. He noticed that the fire looked built up, not burned down as would be expected by 4 a.m. Dr. Alfred Leach arrived soon afterwards and pronounced Edwin Bartlett to be dead. The landlord, Frederick Doggett, spoke to Dr. Leach as he left the house. There should be a post-mortem, he told him, as the sudden death of Edwin was peculiar. Dr. Leach agreed. Thomas Edwin Bartlett had been born in Fulham on the 8th of October 1844, the son of a cabinet maker. After school, he was employed by a grocer, was hard-working, and he, along with a partner, Edward Baxter, established his own store in Herne Hill. Their grocer's business expanded, and soon they had 6 stores across London. In February 1875, he met Adelaide D'Escury, and they married 2 months later. He was then 29 years old, and she was 19. She had been born Adelaide Blanche D'Escury in Orléans, France, in 1855, to Adolphe Collot D'Escury and his wife Clara Chamberlain. Her father claimed to be a French count, son of the Duc de Tours, but it wasn't true. Her father was indeed Adolphe Collot D'Escury, born in 1807, a colourful character. He was Dutch, possibly an illegitimate child of a prominent family in South Holland, and by the early 1840s he was living in Britain. In 1848 he was arrested in Cheltenham for bigamy and assault. He received a 12-month prison sentence with hard labour for the assault and 6 months for the bigamy. He defended himself in court and was described as being ingenious in this. Apparently a handsome man, one newspaper described him as an ebony Adonis. During proceedings he declared he had served in the Dutch Navy as a lieutenant and was in Paris during the July Revolution of 1830, during which he lost his left arm and received the Legion d'honneur from Louis Philippe. Or so he said. By 1853 his first wife had died, and he married Clara Chamberlain from East London. He had at least 8 children by 3 different women, Adelaide being the 5th of these, by Clara Chamberlain. The family lived humbly enough in Kentish Town, Camden, where Adolphe taught French. He died in 1860, when Adelaide was 4 years old, and her mother died when she was 10, after which Adelaide was adopted by a confectioner and his wife, and worked in their shop. She later took lodgings with Charles Bartlett, and it was here she met his brother, Edwin Bartlett, and they were married in Croydon soon afterwards. She spent some time receiving a basic education from a Miss Sarah Dodds at Stoke Newington, and then spent time at a convent in Belgium, possibly with the assistance of relatives of her father, who lived in the area. In 1877, Adelaide and Edwin moved into rooms above Baxter and Bartlett in Station Road, Herne. But Adelaide was restless, and she had a wandering eye, all qualities apparent in her father, whose looks she seemed to have inherited too. She announced to her husband that she was going to stay with an aunt for a week, and soon after her return she announced another week's stay with her aunt. Edwin did not object to this. His mother was seriously ill at the time, and died soon afterwards. Edwin's father moved in with Edwin and Adelaide after his wife's death, but then Adelaide disappeared. Father and son set about looking for her. It was coincidentally discovered that Edwin's younger brother, Frederick, was also missing, and had been missing on both occasions on which Adelaide had been visiting her aunt. The sudden realization that Frederick and Adelaide had been involved in an affair stunned the family. Frederick quickly decamped to America, and Adelaide returned to her husband, who promptly forgave her. Mr. Bartlett Sr. was less forgiving. He held Adelaide in low regard, and spoke freely of her moral lapses. Adelaide learned of this, and demanded her husband force a retraction of old Mr. Bartlett by means of a solicitor's statement. Mr. Bartlett Sr. reluctantly signed this statement. In 1881 there was further scandal, when Adelaide, who had become a devotee of Dr. Thomas Lowe Nichols and his wife Mary, advocates of free love, and whose ideas on sex and contraception were considered shocking to polite Victorian society, sent a copy of Dr. Nichols' book Esoteric Anthropology, The Mysteries of Man, to George Matthews, a friend of Edwin's. It was returned to Adelaide by Mrs. Matthews, his wife, who discovered it. Also in 1881, Adelaide became pregnant, and a nurse called Annie Walker moved in to oversee the birth. Adelaide and Edwin believed that no male doctor should be involved, but when, during labour, Nurse Walker urged its necessity upon them, Edwin apparently rejected this. Eventually a doctor was called, but it was too late. The child was stillborn. Adelaide persuaded Edwin to move to a flat above his East Dulwich shop in Lordship Lane. It was smaller, but had the advantage of possessing no room for her father-in-law. He was close to his son, Edwin, and was forced out into a place of his own. Nevertheless, he visited Edwin every day at one or another of his shops. Edwin had made a will in his wife's favour following their marriage, which stipulated that she should inherit his property conditional on her not remarrying following his death. There was nothing unusual about this in Victorian Britain, but she now began to complain about this to Annie Walker, openly, in her husband's presence. "Don't you think it is a shame that Edwin has made a will that his property will come to me provided I never marry again?" she asked. But Edwin was 36 years old and in excellent health. It seemed to be a small matter to him. His only interests were his business and his St. Bernard's dogs. Then, in early 1885, a young preacher, the Reverend George Dyson, was appointed to the Wesleyan Chapel in Merton High Street. He was the handsome and well-educated 26-year-old son of a respected Methodist preacher. Edwin and Adelaide were taken by his learning and demeanour, and Edwin now secured the young preacher to tutor his wife. By late summer, the once-weekly, one-to-one tutoring sessions had become thrice weekly, and Adelaide even visited Dyson alone in his Wimbledon lodgings. Edwin trusted and liked George, and he encouraged their friendship. By the onset of the autumn, Adelaide had begun to speak of drugs to George Dyson. She possessed a book called The British Companion to the Pharmacopoeia. She also began to speak of a mysterious illness her husband suffered from. She said that she had consulted Dr. Nichols on this, and he had given a dire prognosis. Edwin would not live much beyond a year. Although Edwin showed no signs of illness, George Dyson apparently did not query this. Adelaide and her husband went to Dover that autumn and invited the young cleric to stay. He said he couldn't afford it on his small salary, but Edwin generously paid his train fares for him. Adelaide and George took walks together along the white cliffs of Dover, while Edwin, as ever, continued to work long hours in London at his shops. On the 3rd of September, Edwin at last made out a new will. "I, Edwin Bartlett, will and bequeath all my property and everything I am possessed of to my wife Adelaide for her sole use, and appoint George Dyson, a Wesleyan minister, and Edward Wood, Esquire, solicitor, to be my executors." What prompted Edwin to make this change in his will is unknown, but there was no longer any impediment to Adelaide remarrying if her husband should die. In early October, the Bartletts moved into the apartment at 85 Claverton Street, whose landlord and landlady were Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Doggett. Mrs. Doggett didn't take to Adelaide. She seems to have tried to discourage her from taking the accommodation, but she was reassured when she met Edwin, whom she liked immediately. George Dyson was a regular visitor at the Pimlico flat. He spent whole days and evenings there alone with Mrs. Bartlett, and on one occasion the maid discovered Adelaide with her head resting on George Dyson's knee. During October, Adelaide told George that Edwin's serious illness was getting worse. Dyson had not observed any alteration in Bartlett's cheerful, vigorous disposition. He regularly worked 17-hour days, 6 days of the week. And then, unexpectedly, Edwin Bartlett became ill. At first he was simply tired and depressed, complained of a metallic taste in his mouth and excessive salivation, and this was followed by twitching in his limbs. His gums became spongy and swollen, and a blue line appeared along the margin of his teeth. His teeth became loose, too. Edwin expected to recover from his mysterious illness, but in November his symptoms worsened significantly. He suffered vomiting and diarrhea. In early December, the Reverend George Dyson arrived at the flat to accompany them both to a dog show and found Edwin very unwell. Edwin nevertheless insisted they continue with their plans concerning the dog show. But soon after their arrival there, Edwin took a turn for the worse. Adelaide went in search of a doctor and found Dr. Alfred Leach in Charlwood Street, Pimlico. He was young, newly qualified, and she suggested to him that her husband was something of a hypochondriac. She also told him that he imagined he was suffering from an incurable disease. Dr. Leach called on Bartlett and diagnosed acute gastritis. The condition of Edwin's gums appeared to Leach to be caused by mercury poisoning. He supposed him to be suffering from syphilis and to be treating himself for this with mercury, a standard treatment for syphilis at this time. But on examination he found Edwin was not suffering from syphilis. He asked Edwin if he had been taking mercury. Edwin said he hadn't. Leach thereafter called on his patient each day for the next 3 weeks of December 1885 until Edwin's death. During this period, Adelaide maintained strict control over who was permitted to visit her husband, and she discouraged his father from visiting, claiming falsely that this was at the behest of Dr. Leach. Any visitors who were allowed were permitted to be there only in her presence. Dr. Leach was much taken with Adelaide. She told him she sat and held her husband's foot each night to make him sleep. He suggested she bring in a nurse to take care of Edwin, but she declined. A dentist visited on the 17th of December and made a number of extractions of Edwin's teeth under cocaine anesthetic. Edwin began to improve, but Adelaide continued to block Bartlett Sr., who called each day nevertheless. She even wrote to him on the 18th of December, informing him his visits were quite unwelcome. Plainly furious, Bartlett Sr. called a family conference to discuss his concerns. It was decided as a result of this to consult a new doctor. He told Adelaide of this, and she said they couldn't afford a new doctor, which, he said, was ridiculous. On the 19th of December, Adelaide's 30th birthday, Dr. John Dudley examined Edwin. All his symptoms had disappeared. He could find no signs of any physical disease. Dr. Dudley told Edwin he should get out more and go for a daily walk. He noticed that Mrs. Bartlett answered most of the questions on her husband's behalf. George Dyson called on the 21st of December before departing for Christmas to visit his family in Poole, Dorset, and by the 22nd of December, Edwin was almost fully recovered. He made arrangements to travel to Torquay on Boxing Day, was looking forward to it. Adelaide told him he was too weak for this journey, but Edwin, with Leach's encouragement, was insistent. But when Dr. Leach arrived the following day, Adelaide told him Edwin had passed a lumbricoid worm during the night, and he was now in a hysterical state. He no longer wished to go to Torquay. As a matter of coincidence at this time, Adelaide was worming their St. Bernard's dogs. Leach decided to give Edwin santonin to purge his system, and he awaited the dramatic event which he knew would follow. This was strong medicine and would have unpleasant side effects, but he waited all day and through until 3 a.m. the following morning. Nothing happened. In fact, his patient said he felt quite well. It puzzled him. Leach began to suspect that his patient had taken none of the santonin he had given him, but something innocuous instead. During that fruitless vigil, Edwin told Leach someone had hypnotized him the previous year through his wife. Edwin asked Leach if it was possible he was being mesmerized. Adelaide interrupted. "Oh, Edwin, how absurd you are. He does get some strange ideas into his head, Doctor." But Dr. Leach took this seriously. He inquired why Edwin thought he was under some form of mesmeric control, and Edwin replied that he found himself doing things which were contrary to common sense. Leach asked him how long he had been doing such things, and he replied, "I'm still doing them." Leach was concerned that someone, obviously George Dyson, might have some power over him, and asked if he felt a sinking or depressed feeling when he heard him coming. "No, not at all. I like him," he replied. Leach pressed him further, asking him whether his friend was his real friend or using him for his own ends. Adelaide said, "Edwin and he are best of friends, and he is a true friend to both of us." On the 27th of December, George Dyson returned from Poole, and went out with Adelaide for a walk along the Thames embankment. Adelaide told George that her husband occasionally became delirious, and the only remedy for this was chloroform. She asked him to procure it for her, saying Annie Walker had previously done so, but had now gone to America. She gave him a gold sovereign, and arranged to meet him at 11 a.m. the following morning to receive the chloroform from him. George realized it would be problematic to procure a large quantity of chloroform, so he decided to write to a friend, a medical student in Bristol, to acquire it for him. When he met Adelaide next day, he informed her of this. She was furious at the delay it implied, and sent him off to purchase it himself at once. He duly bought a 1-ounce bottle from a chemist in Upper Richmond Street, and when asked by the chemist what he required this for, he said it was to remove grease stains from a jacket. He then went to another chemist in Wimbledon and requested chloroform for cleaning purposes, receiving 2 ounces in 2 separate bottles, and then went to a third chemist and purchased 2 more ounces on the same pretext. The chemist here suggested ammonia or turpentine would be better, but Dyson told him he preferred chloroform. He now had 5 ounces of chloroform, 150 milliliters, a lethal dose many times over. He decanted these bottles into one single large bottle with a label marked chloroform, poison, affixed to it, and gave it to Adelaide. Dr. Leach took Edwin for a drive in his brougham next day, and Bartlett Senior, who succeeded in seeing his son afterwards, found him well and much invigorated from his outing. Edwin spoke again about going away in a few days' time to Torquay, and told his father he was going to make an allowance for him in the new year. After he had left, Adelaide wrote to her husband's partner, Edward Baxter, requesting that he send mango chutney, walnuts, a fruit cake, and a bottle of Lord's extra brandy for Edwin. Edwin's partner did so, bringing these round himself the following day, and found Edwin resolutely cheerful, looking forward to returning to the business soon. Edwin ate a large meal that day, and visited the dentist for a final tooth extraction under nitrous oxide anesthetic. He was accompanied by Dr. Leach and Adelaide, and the latter was in noticeably high spirits. She told Leach on the journey that she wished she and her husband were not married, so that she could have the pleasure of marrying him all over again. The procedure went well, and Edwin returned home to Claverton Street in excellent form. Edwin told the maid he would get up an hour earlier at the thought of the haddock he had ordered for breakfast on New Year's Day. But Edwin did not rise early the following morning, because he had been found dead in the night. A post-mortem was held the following day, the 2nd of January, 1886, at Claverton Street, by Dr. Thomas Green, pathologist at Charing Cross Hospital, in the presence of Doctors Leach and Dudley. Bartlett Senior waited downstairs with Adelaide. George Dyson arrived, and Adelaide told him Dr. Leach had suggested that a small blood vessel of the heart may have ruptured. Finally, Dr. Dudley appeared. He placed a hand on Bartlett Senior's shoulder and said, "Your son has no business to be lying there, a strong man like that." No pathological cause of death had been found. The contents of the stomach had therefore been preserved for examination by the Home Office analyst, and Dr. Dudley ordered the Bartlett flat to be sealed under the coroner's authority. However, the indiscreet Dr. Leach told them that there had been a strong smell of chloroform from Edwin's stomach. Now George Dyson became agitated. He escorted Adelaide to the Matthews house in East Dulwich to stay. They took a train from Victoria, and Dyson asked Adelaide what she had done with the chloroform. She said she had not used it at all, and refused to discuss it further with him. Dyson was troubled. He had no doubt that Edwin had died of chloroform poisoning, and that Adelaide had administered it to him. But Dyson's greatest concern was the fact that he had procured 5 ounces of it for her from different chemists, on a pretext which would hardly stand up to scrutiny. He had a restless night. Next day he took the 4 empty chloroform bottles he had purchased and discarded them on Wandsworth Common. Dyson then visited Dr. Leach in Charlwood Street and asked him for details of the post-mortem. Leach told him the pathologist was indeed of the opinion that chloroform poisoning was the cause of death. George then went to Friarn Road, East Dulwich, to have it out with Adelaide. Mrs. Matthews overheard their argument. "You did tell me that Edwin was to die soon," said George. "No, I didn't," she shouted. "Oh, my God!" Dyson cried. "I am ruined!" Dyson was overwrought. He could not extricate himself from the business in which he had allowed himself to become thoroughly implicated. He confided all this to Alice Matthews, saying that he had been duped by Adelaide, that she had made him believe Edwin was suffering from a serious illness from which he would soon die. He also told Alice of his purchase of chloroform to soothe Edwin. An inquest was held on the 7th of January before the Deputy Coroner of Westminster in Buckingham Palace Road. Mr. Bartlett Senior spoke of his son as strong and healthy, and criticised his daughter-in-law for restricting his access to his son during the weeks leading up to his death. Adelaide gave as good as she got. She was vituperative, calling Bartlett meddlesome, and said he disliked her as a foreigner and a Roman Catholic. She was, in fact, neither. Her solicitor sensibly decided she should not give evidence at any future hearings. She had dinner with George Dyson afterwards in Victoria, and told him, "If you do not incriminate yourself, I shall not incriminate you." Dyson, George Matthews, and Adelaide met, and she now said she had collected the chloroform bottle from a drawer on the 6th of January, after a police search on the 4th of January had taken place, and emptied its contents into Peckham Rye Pond before throwing the bottle from the window of a train. It was a lie. The pond had been frozen on the 6th of January, and boys were skating on it. On the 26th of January, Adelaide told Leach that she had used chloroform to dampen her husband's ardour, that she and her husband had a platonic relationship, except for one single occasion in 1881, when she had become pregnant, and that her husband encouraged her relations with George Dyson. He had given her to Dyson, she said. It therefore offended her propriety that Edwin suddenly sought sexual favours from his wife. She would sprinkle chloroform on a handkerchief and wave it under his nose, and it would make him sleep peacefully, she said. Even Dr. Leach, a credulous and foolish man, found this unbelievable, and said so. She told Leach she had given Edwin the chloroform bottle on the 31st of December, and told him she would give it to him, and he simply turned away, placing the bottle on the shelf above his head. But Leach was suspicious. There had been no bottle of chloroform on the shelf when he arrived, because he had searched for some possible explanation for Edwin's death. At the reconvened inquest on the 4th of February, Dr. Stevenson of the Home Office stated that a large quantity of chloroform had been discovered in the stomach. It could not be swallowed without a suitable solvent, like brandy, for instance, he said. The Doggets were called. Frederick and Caroline spoke of the glass of brandy and the smell of chloroform. Inspector Henry Marshall showed the Squire's companion to the British pharmacopoeia found in the flat, which he said opened naturally on the page referencing chloroform. Under this entry, it was recommended that chloroform could be made into a suitable solution by mixing it with brandy. On the 11th of February, the inquest reconvened, and in view of the circumstances, the jury requested that Mrs. Bartlett be taken into custody, and Inspector Marshall promptly arrested her and charged her with the murder of her husband. She was held at Clerkenwell Prison, and a verdict was given on the 18th of February of wilful murder against Adelaide Bartlett, with Reverend George Dyson named as an accessory before the fact. Dyson was then also arrested, and both were subsequently remanded to stand trial. The trial of Adelaide Bartlett and George Dyson began on the 12th of April, 1886, at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Wills. The Attorney General, Sir Charles Russell, led for the prosecution, and the defence was led by Edward Clarke, Q.C. The charges against Dyson were promptly dropped. No evidence would be offered against him. Adelaide Bartlett stood alone, accused of murder. Sir Charles opened with details of the case and events leading up to Bartlett's death from chloroform poisoning. He emphasized his previous good health, the impossibility of Edwin's having taken chloroform accidentally, and said that he had gone to bed on the evening of the 31st of December in good spirits, anticipating breakfast in the morning. Suicide was out of the question too, he said. The remaining possibility was that a third person had administered the poison, having first lowered his resistance by means of forcing inhalation of chloroform on him. His wife. Mr. Bartlett Sr. gave evidence concerning his son's marriage to Adelaide, which he believed to have been an affectionate one, and that the couple had lived as man and wife throughout. Frederick Doggett spoke of his mounting suspicions on the 1st of January, the smell of chloroform, the made-up fire, the wine-glass with brandy and ether in it, the absence of any bottle on the mantel-shelf or anywhere else he could see. Caroline Doggett spoke of George Dyson's visits at least 3 times a week, from morning until evening, sometimes more. Alice Fulcher, the maid, told of finding Dyson and Adelaide in the front room with the curtains closed and pinned together. He spoke of noticing that Adelaide had changed her dress and done her hair before summoning help in the early hours of the 1st of January. Dyson was called, and now, off the hook legally, he sought only to protect himself and his reputation. He spoke of his friendship with husband and wife, and agreed it was unusual for a man to be alone with a married lady at the encouragement of her husband, and yet insisted it was so. Under cross-examination, Dyson admitted he had kissed Adelaide in front of her husband. He said also that Bartlett had made it plain that he expected his wife ultimately to be Dyson's, and said he confessed his attachment to Adelaide and suggested the association end, but received further encouragement from Bartlett. The 3 chemists gave evidence concerning their dispensing large quantities of chloroform without prescription, saying their concerns were allayed by Dyson's being a clergyman. Nurse Annie Walker declared she had never procured chloroform for Adelaide on any occasion, nor had been asked to. She said she had never been to America either. Dr. Thomas Lowe Nichols appeared and denied that he had ever communicated with Adelaide or her husband, and was emphatic that he would never give an opinion that a person would die within 12 months without an examination. Dr. Leach gave evidence of his visit to Edwin, commencing on the 10th of December, at which he found him to be suffering from symptoms of mercury poisoning. He had known nothing of chloroform being administered or kept in the flat until Mrs. Bartlett had told him of it in late January, when it had been confirmed as his cause of death. A policeman described how he had searched the flat on the 4th of January and discovered a suit of Edwin's with condoms in the pocket. The case for the prosecution thus ended. The defence called no witnesses at all, but Edward Clarke addressed the jury for 6 hours. He said Mrs. Bartlett had been a most attentive nurse to her husband, that the administration of poison to him would have been difficult, even impossible for her, and much of the evidence adverse to his client was furnished by George Dyson, a known liar. He said that Edwin was a strange man with strange ideas, and he must have reached up for the chloroform above his bed and drank it himself. The Attorney General, Sir Charles Russell, rose the following day to close for the Crown. He dismissed the claims of Adelaide that the marriage had been a platonic one, which had known only one act of sexual congress from which a pregnancy had resulted. The fact that Edwin had condoms in his suit pocket abolished this claim. He dismissed as absurd the notion that when Edwin tried to assert his conjugal rights, Adelaide had replied, "You have made me over to Dyson, and it is unfair to him that you should exercise your rights as a husband. Upon which he turned and drank chloroform. Her affection to her husband in these final days was a mere pretence. She had obtained chloroform for what purpose? Suppressing her husband's libido, she said, a libido she claimed had only once been gratified in 10 years of marriage. It was incredible. Her motive, claimed Sir Charles, was that her husband, with rotting teeth, had become distasteful to her. Mr. Dyson, with superior education and demeanour, had appeared on the scene, and she wished to be with him. Sir Charles Russell sat down, but before Justice Wills delivered his summing up, Edward Clarke asked if Nurse Annie Walker might be recalled. Justice Wills allowed this. Edward Clarke wished to prove that the relationship between husband and wife was, as Adelaide had claimed, a platonic one. He was about to make a serious error. Clarke asked Annie Walker if Mrs. Bartlett had ever spoken to her about the act which had resulted in the pregnancy being a solitary one. "Yes, sir," she replied. Thus it seemed to Clarke he had settled the matter of the Bartlett's platonic relationship quite conclusively. Unfortunately for him, Justice Wills probed her on this, and she said that both husband and wife had told her that on other occasions there was always some preventative used. The recalling of Annie Walker had been a mistake. It made a lie of Adelaide's claim that the relationship had been platonic. It had not. Both husband and wife had told Annie they used preventative measures. Clarke had, inadvertently, proved his client was a liar. The judge's summing up, which followed on from this, rescued the situation to a degree. He was scathing in his opinion of old Mr. Bartlett and George Dyson. He referred to the former as Judas, the latter as a man whose word could not be believed. He praised Adelaide Bartlett for her care, her patience and devotion to her husband, and he expressed his doubts that Adelaide could have poured chloroform down Edwin's throat. But it was probably his own theory that clinched the matter for the defence. This was that Edwin Bartlett had suffered from insomnia and sought relief from it. He spoke of his own personal experience with insomnia and its effect on him, and suggested Edwin Bartlett took chloroform for this reason. He cast doubt on Dr. Leach's claiming the bottle had not been present when he looked for it, calling Dr. Leach not very strong-headed. With this he dispatched the jury to the consideration of their verdict. They returned to great excitement, and the clerk of the court put the vital question, "Do you find the prisoner, Adelaide Bartlett, guilty or not guilty?" The foreman said, "We have considered the evidence, and although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered." There was a roar of approval from the gallery. Edward Clarke was prostrate with exhaustion, tearful, so great was his personal investment in the case. The verdict was not guilty by a hair's breadth, though. Few can have thought otherwise. If the case had been heard in Scotland, it was clear that the verdict would have been not proven. If we accept that Edwin Bartlett died of chloroform poisoning, as we must, there were three, and only three, possibilities for his death: accident, suicide, or murder. Accident is a remote possibility because of the difficulties of swallowing chloroform, which has a corrosive action. The taking of this poison must have involved deliberation on the part of Edwin to take chloroform, or that of Adelaide to administer it to him. Justice Will's suggestion that Edwin may have reached up for the bottle and quaffed it down to facilitate sleep is incredible. First of all, he would have to have known about the chloroform, known its purpose and effect. It would have to have been on the shelf above him, too. If he had uncorked the bottle as he lay there and succeeded in avoiding inhalation and taking it into his mouth, he would have at once felt its corrosive effect. and retched and spat it out, even if he didn't, thinking that it would be therapeutic. When it touched his throat, it would have caused him pain, and he would have cried out. That outcome was made clear at the trial. Adelaide would have heard him. He would not have simply fallen asleep in the manner in which Doggett and then Dr. Leach discovered him, peaceful in his attitude. And if he did take the chloroform himself, in this state of extreme discomfort, how did he manage to recork the bottle and return it to the shelf before settling down to sleep and die? And even if this was possible, how is it that Frederick Doggett and Dr. Leach both failed to see the bottle on the shelf when they entered the room? A bottle which George Dyson had labelled poison, yet was never found. Is it possible that Edwin took the chloroform to commit suicide? The same difficulties arise, and others. He might overcome the problem of swallowing the chloroform by dint of sheer determination, but would he be able to resist crying out? And if he could he replace the recorked bottle on the shelf? Why would he, and why was it missed? All those who saw Edwin on the 31st of December, right up until midnight, agreed he was in excellent form, was looking forward to visiting Torquay, said his ill health was now behind him, looked forward to returning to work in the new year, told the maid he was looking forward to the haddock for breakfast so much he intended to be up an hour early for it. None of these things suggest a man about to take his own life. They suggest the exact opposite. Adelaide had a lover, the Reverend George Dyson. Edwin may or may not have encouraged their intimacy. The only people who affirmed this was Adelaide and George Dyson, who both had vested interest in saying it was so. But even if Bartlett did encourage or permit an intimacy between his wife and Dyson, his reasons for doing so may have been at his wife's insistence. Her power over Edwin was absolute. The occasion related by Dr. Leach concerning Edwin's inquiry on mesmerism was misinterpreted by Leach. He seemed to draw the wrong conclusions about everything. Consider Edwin's conversation as Dr. Leach reported it. He said that he had been hypnotized through his wife the previous year. He said he found himself doing strange things which defied common sense. Dr. Leach immediately assumed he was referring to George Dyson, but Edwin was speaking of his wife and George Dyson together. That is quite clear. His wife was quick to steer this line of conversation. "Oh, Edwin, what strange ideas," she said, and affirmed, "He is a good friend to us both." What can we tell from this? First, that Edwin believed he was being controlled in some way through his wife. Second, that some of the things he found himself doing were odd things, perhaps things he was being persuaded to do. And third, that he did not think the persons involved meant him harm. We can be reasonably certain that he was not doing things wholly against his will, because hypnotism does not confer such powers on the hypnotist. He could not, for instance, be persuaded to purposely kill himself, but he might be made fearful, convinced he was ill. He might be persuaded that it was unsafe for him to leave the apartment. He might be persuaded even to remake his will in certain terms. He might be induced to acquiesce to things his common sense might reject. He said as much. The common thread in all this was his wife, Adelaide, who had an extraordinary influence on him. Even the fact that she held his foot while he slept seems to betray an element of asserting control, of enforcing dependence on him. The evidence against Adelaide is largely circumstantial, but cumulative and compelling. Her desire to control her husband is exhibited at every stage of the 10-year marriage. In his habits, the choice of the places they lived, the people they associated with even. Consider how Dyson admitted to kissing Adelaide in front of Edwin. Those in court found it scarcely believable, but Dyson said it was so, and that Edwin encouraged him to indulge himself with Adelaide. Was this some perverse taste of Edwin's? Perhaps, but it is possible that this is precisely what Edwin referred to when he talked of his doing things which seemed to militate against common sense. We know Adelaide was an aficionado of Dr. and Mrs. Nichols, of their arguments for polygamy and polyandry, hydrotherapy, and other esoteric practices. She had no sooner settled down with her new husband than she had embarked on an affair with his brother, and then had run off with him. Her only reason for returning was that Frederick had no career, no money, no means of keeping her. She returned to her husband, and rather than taming her, the experience brought Edwin in greater thrall to her. There may have been other loves in Adelaide's life. It would be surprising if there were not. Why else would she have sent George Matthews a book on sexual relations, a book shocking to most respectable Victorian people? In court, George Matthews said if he had known what was in the book, he would have returned it unopened immediately. True or not, his wife discovered it and returned it indignantly. It is obvious why Adelaide Bartlett would send such a book to a married man. It was a come-on, a signal that a boundary between two married people of the opposite sex could be breached, and here was its opening gambit. And then came George Dyson, handsome, intelligent, charming, naive. Adelaide Bartlett claimed her husband wished for him to tutor her. We have only her word for this, and it seems less probable than the more obvious explanation that she requested that her husband employ him for this purpose. Did she need a tutor? Dyson was a companion, his role a mere pretense. Their relationship quickly developed. Did Edwin know of it? It may have been the price he was willing to pay for a pretty young wife, or even a perverse delight. Such things are possible. In any case, soon George Dyson was at the apartment 3 times a week, and by the autumn their intimacy had surely become sexual, because this was her nature. He arrived early in the morning, after Edwin had left for work, and remained until the late evening before Edwin's return. Adelaide certainly preyed on suggestible men. It was the one kind of human relationship she excelled at. She had no female friends at all, though she had lived her entire life in London, save for 2 brief periods in France and 1 in Belgium. And yet from school, from her job in a sweet shop, and from any other places she may have lived or worked, she had not garnered a single friend. She had been in touch with Annie Walker for a short time after she left her employment as a nurse, but Annie seemed to have no special regard for Adelaide. Alice Matthews thought her a liar. She distrusted her, with good reason. Caroline Doggett took an instant dislike to Adelaide when she arrived to look at the apartment at 85 Claverton Street. She was a certain kind of woman, easy with men, awkward with her own kind. It is clear that women did not like her at all. Her obvious attractions blinded men to her faults. Edwin was captivated by her from the start. His brother, Frederick, ruined himself by falling for her. She had tried her luck with George Matthews, may have succeeded if his wife hadn't interceded. And then there was the clergyman, George Dyson, a man earning quick promotion in the church. He wrote her silly poems, the sort of poems that a man can only write when he is laboring under the grand delusion of love. Where was he headed with this intimacy? What possible future was there for a 26-year-old clergyman with the wife of another man? Edwin wouldn't hear of his breaking off the friendship, nor would Adelaide, which came to the same thing. But Adelaide understood men, so she confided in him that her husband had a serious illness. She had consulted with the famous Dr. Nichols, and he had informed her gravely that Edwin had a year to live. Dyson was sorry to hear it, of course, but there was a sliver of light here for him too. In a year she'd be a wealthy widow. She sensed George Dyson's mercenary nature, his venality. But Edwin was robust, working 17 hours a day, was a trencherman, enjoyed his food, and walked his big dogs. And then, soon afterwards, the proof of the diagnosis appeared. Edwin became ill. He had gastritis. The internal complaints of which Adelaide had spoken appeared on cue. The symptoms were alarming. It must have seemed that Adelaide had been right. Her husband was suffering a terminal decline. On the 10th of December, Edwin collapsed as they attended a dog show. A doctor was called, Dr. Leach. He may well have been the silliest doctor in London. He took every careful suggestion of hers and grew it to some preposterous conclusion. But when he first examined Edwin, he saw clearly enough his patient was suffering from heavy metal poisoning. The symptoms suggested it. He thought that Edwin had taken mercury for syphilis, but Edwin didn't have syphilis. Of course, there was a far better explanation for this, one the least competent physician in London should have seen. He was being poisoned by someone else, by the only person, in fact, who had an opportunity of doing so, his wife. Adelaide smiled prettily at Dr. Leach. She confided in him her husband's strangeness, his fancies, his self-medicating. It was easy to distract a man like Leach, to send him down a rabbit warren of suggestions. Mr. Bartlett Senior, on the other hand, was a nuisance. He didn't like his daughter-in-law, and he certainly didn't trust her. Her coquettish charm had the opposite effect on him. It fostered mistrust. Edwin got better. The blue line around his gums vanished. So did the other alarming symptoms. It was absolutely clear to Adelaide that the heavy metal poison was suspected. She now did everything she could to isolate her husband from his family and his friends, from others, from anyone who might interfere with her control of Edwin. When anyone was in the room with him, she was there too, quick to intercede, to steer the conversation in another direction. She had inveigled her husband into making a will without any restrictive remarriage conditions. It was his death warrant. She had every intention of remarrying. She had a suitor waiting in the slips, eager for the off, George Dyson. Edwin's recovery was such that he was keen to visit Torquay. It was as if he might slip through Adelaide's fine-spun net. She told him he was not up to the journey. She was a woman of endless resources and ingenuity, but arrangements were being made for Torquay. It was a done deal. And then Dr. Leach arrived, to pandemonium. Edwin had discovered a lumbricoid worm in his chamber pot, and the trip to Torquay was abandoned. Leach administered a powerful purgative drug to no effect. He was mystified. It did not occur to him, even for a moment, that Mrs. Bartlett had introduced the lumbricoid worm to prevent the trip and had played a sleight of hand to ensure that the deception of the lumbricoid worm was not discovered. Leach had all these facts before him, yet was unable to put them together. But Edwin, in spite of all this horror inflicted upon him, was indisputably recovering physically. Dr. Leach took him out for a drive, and Edwin enjoyed it. His spirits were good. He was speaking about Torquay again in a few days, as soon as the new year was in. He told his father he was going to make an allowance for him. He probably intended a change in his will to accommodate this. Adelaide had no time to lose. She told George Dyson that she needed chloroform to help her husband sleep. The mercury or other heavy metal poison was now far too risky. The symptoms had been noted, so had their cause. She told him Annie Walker used to buy chloroform for her, but had now gone to America. It was a lie. But George Dyson wrote to a friend in Bristol instead. She was furious, because this would delay the matter until the new year. It would be too late. She ordered him to fetch chloroform for her immediately, and this time, using subterfuge, he did. Adelaide now had the means, as well as the motive, and awaited only opportunity. On the 31st of December, it came. She was in a hyper mood. Hyper because this was the day on which she would murder her husband. She showed him affection. Too much. "I wish I wasn't married to Edwin," she said, "so I could have the pleasure of marrying him all over again." It was absurd. They were going to the dentist. Edwin was naturally apprehensive before he went to the dentist. He'd been seriously ill for weeks. It had been an awful period. Her expression was entirely dissonant with the occasion. Although he didn't know it, Edwin Bartlett had only a few hours to live. His wife's excitement had been growing noticeably as the moment of her great enterprise drew near, even to the point of misjudgment. Edwin spoke of getting up early on the morrow for breakfast, but he wouldn't see the morning. Only Adelaide knew that, as she stood looking on, quietly thrilled. Her control was now absolute. Edwin went to bed. It was New Year's Eve, 1885. Revellers called to each other in the street below. Adelaide had a treat for him, fruit-cake and brandy. Midnight was the perfect time. The Doggets had guests, a small party to bring in the new year. There would be noise. The maid attended to the fire and then retired. A toast to the new year, to health and happiness, to the future. She gave Edwin some brandy, drank some herself. Perhaps he tossed it down in sudden resolution for the future. Now that she is secure from conviction, in the interests of science, she should tell us how she did it. Sir James Paget famously quipped. It was the greatest irrelevance, one to which so much unnecessary attention was given in court by the medical men, intent on dancing on the heads of pins. How could she have judged the degree of unconsciousness sufficient to ensure Edwin's swallow reflex was not suppressed to enable her to administer the lethal dose? They asked. She didn't have to. He drank it himself in the brandy chloroform solution, as per the recommendation in Squire's Pharmacopoeia, which we know Adelaide had studied. She required the fruit-cake and walnuts to provide cover for the real object of her purchase, the brandy. She said Edwin had a fancy for these things, but it is absurd to imagine Edwin would want walnuts with his teeth and gum problems. Edwin took the chloroform and brandy, and it had its effect. She then poured a stronger solution of brandy and chloroform down his throat, which he swallowed as he sank deeper and deeper into a world of eternal sleep. She said she had poured half a pint of brandy down Edwin's throat to revive him. It neatly explained why Leach found it spilled all over his chest. But it is an incredible claim that she woke, found her husband cold, his eyes staring, his limbs already stiffening with rigor mortis, and poured half a pint of brandy down his throat. Edwin was dead, as voices raised in the cheers of New Year drifted up from the party below. In the bedroom there was stillness. The widow composed herself, made any arrangements she needed to make, changed her dress, had not a hair out of place when seen by the maid. She built up the fire. It was a cold night. She concealed the chloroform now, because she believed that the obliging Dr. Leach would certify death as being due to natural causes. But when she raised the alarm and Frederick Doggett entered the room, there was something she was quite unaware of. He was a registrar of births and deaths, and he knew a great deal more about the business of death than she could have realized. He noted immediately the smell of chloroform. He saw the condition of Edwin, the degree of cold affecting him, of rigor mortis, and he said Edwin had been dead for 2 or 3 hours. That must have surprised her. She said she had found him lying on his front and turned him over to his present position. Doggett looked at the neat state of the bed and saw at once it was impossible. He intimated as much. She must have been startled, because she then gave the information that she had closed his eyes when she realized he was dead. The two statements were inconsistent. Doggett was concerned. He looked around the room, took stock, examined the glass of brandy. All was not well. There was most certainly not a bottle on the shelf marked chloroform, poison. Leach arrived and suggested the possibility of a heart attack. He would surely have certified Edwin's death to this effect, had not Doggett taken him aside and told him he would not register the death without a post-mortem. Leach could only agree. George Dyson must have suspected something, whatever tales Adelaide had fed him over the past few months. The purchase of the chloroform caused him discomfort. It may be that he swept aside the nagging doubts he had in the matter because he didn't wish to know. But there are many instances in which he was wilfully blind. He was Edwin's friend. He took his money, but he was abusing his trust and his position as a clergyman. He probably had some role in the mesmerism to which Edwin seems to have been subjected, because Edwin suggested this. Was it Dyson who had hypnotized him? Edwin did not explicitly say this, but he was clearly referring to Dyson in his assertion to Leach that he was being led into doing things that made no sense. Dyson claimed he had qualms of conscience when Edwin changed his will, but these were ephemeral enough, and in any case, we depend only on Dyson's word for this. The will was altered in Adelaide's favour. She had said Edwin was ill, would soon die. She was involved in a liaison with Dyson. He must have seen where this was headed. There must have been conversations between Adelaide and George Dyson over the course of their relationship, of which we know nothing. There was a tacit agreement on the future between them, certainly. He said he had been duped, yes, to an extent. But when asked to purchase chloroform for Adelaide, a drug so dangerous that it came with a poison label on it, and the chemists queried its purpose, and that he lied and repeated this act 4 times, the self-deception involved is astonishing. There must have been a level of consciousness involved. With the news about Edwin's death, Dyson was unsettled, but not panicked. That was yet to come. On the 2nd of January, the post-mortem revealed Edwin was physically healthy. Edwin had not been, as Adelaide had claimed, terminally ill. He was physically sound, and yet here he was, quite dead. And then the indiscreet Dr. Leach mentioned chloroform. Now George Dyson understood very well what this meant. He and Mrs. Bartlett alone in the world knew that Edwin had died of chloroform poisoning, and that he, George Dyson, had bought that chloroform, and Adelaide had administered it. He demanded to know what she had done with the chloroform he had procured for her. Mrs. Matthews heard him say, "You did say he would be dead within a year." The scales were falling from his eyes. "Oh, my God," he exclaimed, "I am ruined." He was right. He would be ruined as soon as the facts came out. But his concern was entirely for himself, for his position, and his complicity in the affair. It seems to me that he had in some sense known that Adelaide would murder her husband, or was threatening to do so. It was the ruin her apprehension would bring to him that concerned him. At no point did he express any sorrow at the death of Edwin, who had treated him with great generosity. For her part, Adelaide was contemptuous of George Dyson. She had another weak lover about to desert her, like Frederick. "I will not say anything to implicate you if you do not," she told him. It was a clear threat. We will be safe if we pull together. George Dyson was about to jump ship. At length they were both arrested and sent for trial. Charges were dropped against Dyson because it was hoped he would prove a better witness for the prosecution than a defendant. That proved to be wrong. He came across as a self-serving, unreliable man who had behaved appallingly. Adelaide was acquitted because it ran against the grain to hang a pretty young woman. She certainly got away with murder, and George Dyson assisted in this to the extent that he was involved in the subterfuges which probably included hypnotism employed against Edwin. Weeks after Edward's death, Adelaide inherited his £3,500 fortune, £600,000 in 2024 terms. It seems likely to me that she would already have secured a good portion of his wealth prior to his death. She had such control of her husband, and had coveted his fortune for too long for it to be otherwise. According to the press after the trial, Adelaide Bartlett received 17 marriage proposals. Whether she took up any of these offers, we do not know, because she disappeared from view, and although many stories over the years have been told about her, that she became a nurse in Canada or the United States, a piano teacher in Boston or Connecticut, nothing is known for certain. I have been unable to follow in the footsteps of those who have made these claims, though I certainly can't dismiss them. There is a fascinating postscript to this story, though. After the trial, George Dyson was removed from the list of Wesleyan ministers. He changed his name to John Bernard Walker and travelled to the United States. Here he married Eliza Bell Wilson in early 1887 in Oregon, and they had a son, George, in 1889. Afterwards, they moved to New York, where George Dyson, also known as John Bernard Walker, became editor of the Scientific American magazine. He wrote several successful books, including An Unsinkable Titanic, the first notable work written on the disaster, which was published in 1912. He was highly regarded as a naval expert, attended dinners with Roosevelt, and was appointed chairman of the United States Navy Committee. His marriage ended sometime after 1900, and later his son wrote a letter to an English friend of his father's saying he had made his wife very unhappy, and they had divorced. John Bernard Walker remarried in 1910 at the age of 52 to a wealthy 26-year-old society woman called Ernestine Miller. 5 years later, in 1915, he tried to have her committed to an insane asylum, which she resisted, claiming she was being led into believing things that were not so. It was a peculiar case, and eventually she consented to enter an institution voluntarily. 1 year later, on the evening of August the 19th, 1916, John Bernard Walker arrived home, having been absent from the house for several hours. He found he could not gain entrance to the front door with his key. With assistance from neighbors, he succeeded in cutting a panel from the door and entering the house. In the kitchen, he found his wife lying dead on the floor, the gas flowing from the unlit lights and the oven, whose door was open. Ernestine had been dead for several hours, according to the doctor who examined her. At the inquest, it was heard that she had been depressed, and the verdict was given as suicide. Her family, who neither liked nor trusted Walker, were convinced she had been murdered by him. We can never know exactly what happened on that night in 1916, but the events bear a striking similarity to those involving another case covered in this series, that of William Herbert Wallace in Liverpool in 1932. The apparent alibi involving an absence from home about the time of the death, and the care taken to ensure witnesses were present by being unable to gain access to the home, are especially striking. Had he been attempting to drive her insane? This too bears a strange, familiar echo to the way in which the screw was gradually turned on Edwin Bartlett 30 years earlier, at which a series of happenings seemingly undermined his reason, to the point where he inquired of Dr. Leach whether it was possible that someone was hypnotizing him through his wife. We shall never know. Ernestine's sister, many years later, said she wished the family had pressed to have the matter investigated. There was a shadow which hung over John Bernard Walker after this. There were whispers. Those whispers would have risen to a roar had anyone known that John Bernard Walker, 30 years before, as a young clergyman in London, had stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, charged with supplying the poison by which his lover's husband was murdered. He was shunned in polite society for a second time in his life, and there was a curious absence of obituaries on his death, with the sole exception of an entry in the Scientific American, whose editor he had been. John Bernard Walker, who had once been Reverend George Dyson, died in New York on the 17th of October, 1928, at the age of 70.